Spy Cops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police that infiltrated over 1,000 groups since 1968. Episode 32. Jenny, Me and Bobby McGee, featuring Maxine Peake. Made in conjunction with Police Spies Out of Lives. Welcome to Spy Cops Info Podcast. My name is Tom Fowler and I'm joined with...
Jenny from the Spy Cops Inquiry.
So this is a bit different today. To respect her anonymity, the Inquiry modulated Jenny's voice. We're going to do something better. Instead of hearing her voice, you're going to be hearing the voice of an actor, Maxine Peake. So Jenny gave evidence to the Inquiry on Monday, along with B, both related to the undercover officer HN78, alias Bobby McGee, alias Bobby Lewis, real name Trevor Morris, alias Carlton King, the Black James Bond.
Oh, so we understand as of tonight.
Yeah, so we're in the middle of his evidence. We've heard a day and a half so far. There's another day to go. How do you think it's going?
Well, it's so hard to tell because I've never been to a public inquiry before in my life. To paint a picture, we're being dragged into this anonymous office in central London. Both sides go up in a separate lift, and then on the day, it's just banks and banks of lawyers. And at the far end of the room, this small figure in a suit, who initially I didn't recognise. I'm going to call him Trevor Morris, this figure in a suit, because I'm trying to separate the person I know from the person I found out he is. Trevor Morris is sitting at the far end of the room. We can just about see him over the heads of the police lawyers. He is wearing, I think, a three-piece suit in grey, nice silver tie.
No expense spared.
Yeah, no expense spent. He's entirely unapologetic about his role in the police, and the part of that role obviously involved just kind of deceiving me and B into relationships, which is where we come into the inquiry. But his questioning seems to be taking now at least 3 days and counting, and they've asked him everything from infiltrating family support groups to, I guess, coming up tomorrow, his sex life, which is, well, is weird.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be strange for you. Just to put it in some sort of context, so you were active in the Socialist Workers' Party back in the 90s, right?
Yeah, I joined the SWP in the late 80s, had an on-off relationship with it. So I join and move, and then another branch, then come back. To me at the time, it felt like the SWP was the broadest movement of the left-wingers. So I joined. I ended up in North and East London, and I met him through friends. He was in a different branch of the SWP, and this was a time when racist attacks were becoming more and more common across the part of London, and there was a lot of activity around those topics. One consequence of that was the SWP then reignited an organisation called ANL, which is the Anti-Nazi League, specifically to build anti-fascist activity, to really tackle the BNP, who were becoming quite confident and were completely open and brazen about selling their newspapers on the streets and kind of having a political presence. But at the same time, young lads were being beaten up and even murdered by night. So it was very, very scary times. And I became involved in the ANL as well.
Yeah, it's a really typical story, right? Someone who's involved in activism from the time period and would have probably been unremarkable. You wouldn't even think of it that much if you hadn't been for meeting Trevor Morris during that time, right?
Yeah, well, I think this is the thing that really blows my mind, because a lot of the time that we were kind of campaigning for back in the day, things are quite mainstream now, not being a racist, pretty fundamental feminism, gay rights, environmentalism. These are all things that we talk about now. But back in the day, it felt like Labour was really drifting really far to the right under Kinnock and then under subsequent leaders. And what else can you do?
Imagine that, the Labour Party drifting to the right suddenly.
That's where the rot started, frankly, and then just continued. So what else are you meant to do if you believe in social justice in a fairer world? So yeah, I joined the SWP. I wasn't the best comrade. I did the paper sales, the ones I could. I went to a lot of marches. I did prefer getting stuck into activity than going to educationals or, you know, standing outside the tube in the rain trying to get people to take a leaflet. But yeah, I went to a party one night with a girlfriend who was in a different part of London, a different branch, and was mooching around the kitchen at midnight. And this figure burst in, and he's straight from Central Casting. He's got the biggest beard. He's got a black beret. He's got red stars pinned on it. And he starts going through all the drawers and cupboards. And I made a joke about him raiding the joint. And he laughed. And he had the best laugh ever as well, you know, really infectious. And we got to talking. And that's how I met an undercover police officer.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing what you can find at a house party kitchens at 1 a.m, right? So, I mean, like, you knew him for a number of years, just like through the movement, right?
Yeah, it just felt like I'd never seen him before that night. And then after that night, he was everywhere. So every time we went on a march, he was there. He'd come up to me and my friends. Every time we went to a fundraiser, he'd DJ. Very bad choices of music, I'll be said. Not very exciting. He was suddenly everywhere. But weirdly, he wasn't very political. So he'd always be there with a smile and a hug and a gossip and wanting to know what was going on with you. And it's just quite unusual, you know, for a man on the left. This is a bit harsh. He was a man who really enjoyed female company, and he was a really good listener, right? So rather than kind of corny you than badger you about theory, he'd just have really good crack.
Yeah. It's not surprising, really. It doesn't take much for a man to cosplay like a human being because, like, you know.
Yes, the bar is so low, right?
Totally. I mean, men are disappointing, aren't they? So, like, you knew him through the movement, for, like, on and off for years?
Yeah, a couple of years. So 2-3 years.
We heard him talking about his involvement with the SWP. And to hear him speak at the inquiry, he's, like, right in the middle of it. He, like, meets with members of the Central Committee. He's inside all this decision-making. Was that what he was like?
Well, it's the weirdest thing, isn't it? Listening to him this week, we've heard how he was and wasn't leading activity in East London. He was and wasn't a regional organiser of the Anti-Nazi League. And it seemed to me that he was everywhere, but he didn't have very deep relationships. So he kind of, you know, knew who everyone was. He'd have all the gossip, but in terms of actually leading anything, I don't think he could have led his word to a paper bag, frankly.
Right. We've heard this before. We heard this from like other undercovers. Like the other week, we had Roger Pierce. We did an episode on the other day, which you haven't listened to. I recommend going back and checking it out. But one of the things he claimed was to be a really close confidant of Dave Morris.
Interesting.
Now, Dave Morris gave evidence before him, and he went, I don't remember this guy. Maybe I met him, and then when Roger Pierce was actually questioned on it, he had to admit he only spent time with Dave Morris once on like a trip to Cardiff, and he totally understood that Dave Morris had forgotten. What was telling, one of the different things that Trevor Morris did was that people that he claims that he was close to haven't been called to give evidence. So like Chris Banbury, who he talks about quite a lot, and he claims to be like really close, good friends with, who and he clearly hasn't liked in the evidence. We've heard his name so much over the last few days.
Yeah, I really don't understand how the inquiry works. I don't really understand how those choices are made. I mean, it's all hearsay. Is it even admissible? Surely if people are mentioned, they should have the right to reply.
You'd think, right? I get asked quite a lot. For some reason, people seem to think I should know, like the way the inquiry works. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But it's something we've heard again and again. We had like Rebecca Johnson the other day, who was involved with Greenham. And when like Hilary Moore was giving evidence, she kept saying, you should ask Rebecca. And she was there in the room, like just getting increasingly annoyed. I mean, like Chris Banbury wasn't in the room, but his ears must have been burning.
Really burning. And a few things that Trevor Morris has told the inquiry. I really wish that Chris Banbury had the right of reply. So one of the big headlines that Trevor Morris has delivered is that the SWP, far from their official line, which was, we want to build a mass movement. Therefore, to build a mass movement, we can't afford to do things that are violent, possibly terrorist. We're not about that. So we're about getting as many people in the streets in a kind of peaceful way, do a bit of shouting, build a movement, and kind of, tackle fascism from the ground up. And the big headline thing that Trevor Morris has come out with is he claims that there were hitter squads. These hitter squads were kind of a clandestine movement led by Chris Bambury on a mission to tool up and go and fight fascist bare knuckle, which was news to Lindsay German. I mean, Dr. German was sitting right behind us today and looking completely baffled.
Yeah. It's interesting because this is a key part of the SWP history, kicking out the squadists who became Red Action. And the idea they would recreate that again, like years later, sounds just nonsensical. I mean, I've got to put my cards on the table. I'm an adventurist anarchist. I've got very different politics to the SWP. And it was something that I would have criticized them for, was not having hitters units or whatever they wanted to call them. And at the same time, you had other left-wing groups that were politically taking on the fascists, like with AFA, Anti-Fascist Action. I think these formations were very necessary and a positive thing. But like for those of us who disagree with the SWP, it was really weird to hear them being accused of it.
As if it were a fact.
Yeah, like you kept that quiet.
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing, isn't it? And it's kind of his justification for the sheer scale of infiltration. So there's this whole narrative, and this narrative has come up throughout the inquiry that even the women who were, seduced, for want of a better word, by these undercover officers, what we're really being asked about to begin with is this strategy and violence. And what kind of feels, it's a bit like if you're attacked at night, you're being asked how short your skirt was, as if you're actually asking for that level of infiltration. And the argument that he seems to be coming up with is yes, because they were dangerous and they were in fact going out to fight fascists, and it's quite a hard process, that. I mean, there is many levels that you go through once you've found out that somebody from your past was an undercover officer, and there are many layers and levels to it. But for the first reaction, for I think a lot of us, and certainly for me, was, oh my God, what happened to my judgment? I really thought I understood people generally, and this person in particular. And if I'm wrong about this, what else am I wrong about? So when you go to an inquiry and you have somebody who you knew back in the day who you don't recognise, he was not the same person. The accent's the same, the gestures are the same, but he's incredibly patrician and very full of himself.
Oh my God, is he full of himself?
He probably thinks this interview is about him.
Yeah. I think everything's about him, as far as I can tell.
It really is, isn't it? I mean, he's got many areas. He could probably do podcasts for you, give you podcast lessons.
He'd do a podcast series, maybe 100 episodes.
Do you think that could ever happen? Going with this is that when you're sitting there and you're listening to somebody completely revise your own political history of belief, it kind of brings you up short, and you think, did we think this? And actually, no, I do call bullshit.
Yeah, it does make you second guess. Maybe there were secret hitter units. Maybe Chris Bambury actually was a firebug and desperate to burn places down. I mean, particularly that story of Chris Bambury's secret plan to go and burn down the BNP HQ the morning of the march. We spent an inordinate amount of time on that particular topic today.
Yeah, and should we just unpack that? So the story we heard today was that the BNP had headquarters in southeast London, and we were shown a map and all the different attacks. And it was Stephen Lawrence. Who else?
Roland Adams.
So we were looking at this map of southeast London. Welling was in the middle, and then these 4 or 5 racist attacks took place, kind of in a radius. And in the middle of that part of Welling was the BNP bookshop. And so the left became very aware quite fast that there was this kind of epicenter of race hate that was not just the bookshop, that was a place of organisation for the hard right.
I mean, people keep calling it a bookshop, but I mean, there's only so many copies of Mein Kampf you can flog, right?
Yeah, so one for each member of the BNP and one for the mum. So anyway, there was a big campaign to mobilise and march on the BNP headquarters. And there were many marches, quite a few. There was only one big march that everyone was building up to in 1993 in October. And the narrative about the hitter squads was kind of in the run-up to this march happening. And then Trevor Morris changed his story and said, well, actually, in addition to hitter squads, there was also this really deep undercover plan to fireball the bookshop. And this was in his witness statement, which I can't discuss because I'm under restriction order. But it did come out in this inquiry today in a lot more detail.
I would say the restriction order has ended. Once he started giving live evidence, all those documents are in the public domain. So you're good.
No, well, there was a lot more today. It was really fascinating. And he claimed, and he was given a piece of paper, and that was part of a really small select group of people who'd been chosen for this mission, led by Banbury, to go out and firebomb the BNP headquarters. And David Barr, Casey, was asking the questions, and he said, write the names down. So the names were written down, and there were 4 names on the piece of paper, one of whom was Banbury. And the other, surprise, surprise, was Trevor Morris under his previous identity of Bobby McGee. I think we should say this in case anyone knew him back in the day. So his undercover identities were either as Anthony Lewis or Bobby Lewis or Bobby McGee. And if you've met anybody under those names in the early 90s, I would definitely urge you to come forward. So a piece of paper, 4 names on it, and the plan, according to Morris today, which he hadn't heard before, was the 4 of them were going to get the train down to Welling, and apparently did, set off to Welling on the morning of the demonstration. And then it sort of all kind of fell apart, didn't it, the telling, because we had this conspiracy and the 4 names and the train journey. And when I first heard this, I was thinking, well, how did they take all that stuff in the train? And it transpired that actually, no, nobody had any matches on the train. Nobody had any gloves on the train. Nobody had any flammable items on the train. And in fact, did the train get diverted?
So essentially, according to him, it was simply that it didn't stop at the right station.
Yes. So then let's go back and get a bus.
Yeah, so supposedly they left Welling. I forget the station it was meant to be they went to stop at, but they supposedly then they travelled all the way back to Hackney to get on board the coaches to go there. And my geography of London is not very good. I think yours is better. That's quite a bit of a mission of a journey. Like, would you do that? Why would you do that? Wouldn't you just get off at the next stop, get a bus back?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense.
And also, I don't think they had matches and lighters on the coach either, so not much of the plot.
No. Yeah, and like, he owned a car, right? Like all the undercover cops, they had a vehicle and they decided not to use it for that particular mission.
Yeah.
There's so many holes in it. The idea the SWP would undermine their own march by destroying the thing that they're marching against on the morning of the march, even just from like a cynic's point of view about the SWP, there's no way they do that. You know, maybe they'd burn it down the next day. I could believe a bit more, but burn it in the morning of the march, it just doesn't make any sense.
And then to fail to do it, then kind of talk up your role in the plot, but also talk down your role.
Yeah, he did a great deal of like making out he was central and important to everything. And then like, no, he was very reluctant.
Yeah, not me.
He wasn't really involved. I mean, he uses the term schizophrenic, which I think is a misuse of it and quite problematic.
It's quite insulting.
Yeah, it's incredibly insulting. But he keeps using the phrase, not just in this, but in like other statements we've heard from him. One thing I was shocked by, which I hadn't really grasped at first, there's no contemporaneous reports about this. The first time there's any reference to it is in 2013, where he tells Operation Hearn, which is like the first internal investigation into undercover policing, about the plot. And he's like, you didn't report it. And he said, no, I didn't report it. Well, why haven't you got the reports? And he's like surprised, claiming there's all these extra reports, which we know full well that anything this level of serious violence in it wouldn't have just had one report. It would have been referenced in other reports. You know, they look back at it, it would turn up in other things. There's so many composite reports we've been shown of meetings and security services where things like this have come up. Like, harking back to Roger Pierce again the other day, he had all these bombs that were supposedly set. And when pushed on a couple of the ones, like one particular one, he was like, oh no, he was asked the reference and Barr said, well, the only reference I've got is you. So he just like dropped it.
Yeah, I remember that. You know, I was actually listening into that session, and actually I've personally decided not to listen into a lot of the inquiry because it can be quite triggering to hear how they talk about us collectively and specifically. But that was the one with Pierce. But that one with Pierce was told that there was a bomb, but then can we remember who gave him the piece of intelligence? Like, oh, whoops, oh, sorry, I forgot his name. You would never forget the name if someone told you where a bomb was.
No, it's laughable.
It really is.
But I think Barr gave Morris a lot of opportunities to go like, oh, I must have got confused, or maybe that wasn't right. Maybe I misremembered. But he was having none of it. He was definitely right. He definitely knew. And for someone who went to great lengths at the start of his evidence to say that he had memory problems, that he was really bad on names and timings, and he'd been to the doctor about it. And a lot of people got problems with remembering stuff from 30 years ago, but he's a different level. And then he goes on to be really bullish and argumentative about how good his memory is all the way through, whilst also saying like, oh, well, I've got a memory problem, of course.
Yeah. I mean, to me, he came across as sharp as a tack. I've always thought that about him, but he was, he was very, very capable and a very, very intelligent man. But what I understand, having read more about him, is that he was quite thwarted within a racist police force and never got the recognition that he deserved. And at this point, has come to an inquiry as quite a bitter person who's got some things he wants to get straight and some scores he wants to settle. He was very dogmatic, wasn't he? He was absolutely controlling the narrative from start to finish. He came across actually having been a lovely person, a funny person. He was a really good company back in the day. And I don't know, this week he just came across as someone very dogmatic, very hard work.
The lack of respect he has for the process was quite weird. He kept talking over Barr. Well, Barr was asking him sensitive questions on a sensitive topic, like a dead child or something like really serious. And he's going, yep. And he can't wait to speak. And he's trying to hurry Barr along as he was talking. He's so full of himself.
Yeah, this is another thing that came up in the inquiry today. He said in his statement that he chose the identity of the child, the identity he stole. And then he said he used the jackal technique, which is straight from, I think, Day of the Jackal. You go down to the records office, you look at the death records, and you find someone suitable who's died quite young and fairly unremarkable circumstances, And I think he confessed in his written statement that he chose the identity of a particular child, Anthony Lewis. I don't think he claimed he knew the racial identity of the original Anthony Lewis. It says in the death certificate that Anthony Lewis died of sickle cell related conditions and had a very moving testimony from the real Anthony Lewis family, who's been incredibly brave and incredibly articulate. And then this is a really good example of how brash and shameless Trevor Morris is. Today he came in and he wanted to be known that he and his wife had had conversations overnight, and his wife informed him that he hadn't wanted to choose the identity of Anthony Lewis. He wanted to pick for himself a completely different identity. And then you kind of think about that really hard and how that must have really landed with the family. That's just what is that even? It's insensitive, insulting.
Another level of it, right?
Yeah, shameless.
Shameless, completely shameless. He's a former detective. Like, my knowledge of the legal system is not all that, but I'm pretty sure that you're not, like, in the middle of being questioned. You're not meant to go away and confer with your wife about what you've said and then correct. It just seems incredibly unprofessional for a cop to behave in this way, in this process. He doesn't come across as a credible witness in any way.
It backfired quite badly, didn't it? Because then I think they produced the evidence in his statement to show that he had, in fact, when he said in his statement, and then he had to backtrack and say maybe his wife misremembered. Not good for his credibility as a witness.
And not very good for his marriage, I wouldn't have thought. I mean, she must be having a torrid time with him.
I hate to throw your wife under the bus.
Yeah, but from what we know of him, he doesn't appear he's got much loyalty to anybody.
He's very strange. He keeps talking about female activists, the whole list of people on the first day of evidence that he was reporting on. And there were names that I recognised as partners of people, female partners of people quite high up in the organisation. And I didn't really understand why he was singling up wives and girlfriends and not the actual party leaders. He seems quite an odd person. Kind of like he went in below central committee level, kind of talked of what he found rather than what he needed to know, which was much higher up. And he wasn't in those circles at all, well, as far as I can tell.
That first set of reports of his, where he's got the profiles on all the female activists. I mean, it just sounds like he's like, yeah, I went to a party and there were all these chicks there, and there was this girl and she was like this, and then there was this girl and she was like that, and there was this other girl and she was like that. And it's like, what are you doing, bruv? It's like completely
Austin Powers.
Yeah, Austin fucking Powers. Yes, exactly. Yes.
Do I make you horny, baby?
Oh.
I mean, we're not going to be able to look at him tomorrow.
So I've been putting off talking about this, but this evening we've discovered that not only is he all of these alter egos back in the 90s, but he's also got an alter ego now of Carlton King.
The Black James Bond.
And he's written a book of his life.
Oh, maybe we shouldn't promote it.
I mean, maybe we shouldn't promote it, but listeners are going to be intrigued.
Yeah, if they've got 500 pages of reading time to spare.
Yeah, it's called Black Ops. It was self-published, so that tells you the quality of it. And it was published 7 years ago. So after the inquiry had started, he's also got a podcast series called the Black Spy Podcast, which looks terrible. I haven't really listened to it yet. I mean, literally, I've just discovered it in the last couple of hours. He seems a complete fantasist on every level and is a self-publicist, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we're picking up today, aren't we? How much control he wanted to be of the narrative. And it turns out he's got the whole sideline in controlling his own narrative across many, many different types of media. Yeah, we've been dipping into the book tonight. It's really interesting because he's clearly worked in security services all over the world.
Yeah, that's another thing. We saw some of his in-depth reports where he reported to have some sort of analysis of what the SWP was doing, like the internal strategy of it. And they just read like sixth form essays. I mean, is this the level of all these top secret documents? You get the impression that maybe they're kept secret because they're so basic and crap that the whole edifice would fall down if people realized how little intelligence there is in the intelligence community.
It must be really striking reading what he's written and hearing what he had to say the last few days. Things that he says are true, are things that I think he'd know if he'd gone on a march, if he'd just policed a march and picked up a couple of leaflets, or maybe, God forbid, bought a socialist worker on your way home of an evening. And there are many other things in there that I feel are blatantly untrue. I'm not sure the taxpayers were getting the money's worth.
No. There's a phrase for it, isn't there? Everything he says that was true isn't new, and everything he says that's new isn't true.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Yeah, but he's been quite creative, I think, with some of his reporting, and the Welling demonstration. So when the firebomb didn't happen because they all caught the train without the matches.
It's like a sitcom. It really is.
It's like a really bad 70s sitcom, isn't it? Right up there with Dad's Army.
Yeah.
So when the firebombing didn't happen, the demonstration took place. And this officer, as far as we can work out, had given intelligence about the firebomb plot to the superiors.
Well, supposedly, but then we haven't got a copy of it. We've got copies of him talking about the hitters, which he claims basically that everybody's up for a fight.
Yeah.
And there was one bit in the questioning where it was said to him that the SWP were trying to provoke the entire crowd to go for a fight and have serious violence with the police. And in order to do that, the SWP was going around recruiting from schools. It's like, this sounds like ridiculous.
I don't believe that either, by the way. Yeah, that was just another thing on Planet Trevor. So anyway, this is October 1993. The firebombing hasn't happened. The rumour of the hitter squads has spread. And the result of that is that and I can't remember how many people went, but I think it was about 30 to 50,000 people, all of them good anti-racists from all different traditions of the anti-racist left, anarchist students, everybody, all went to Welling and were greeted by riot police with long shields. And I've talked about this to friends subsequently and quite recently. And they blocked off the road to the bookshop. And then the police closed in on demonstrators from all sides. And my understanding of what happened that day, which isn't Trevor Morris's version of events, is that people were kettled and people being squeezed, people having to jump over walls into a cemetery, people running because it was getting really, really, really nasty. And what I'd like the inquiry to establish is whether that heavy-handed policing was as a direct result of what Trevor Morris told them to expect. Because if that's true, he's got actual blood on his hands.
Yeah. We don't know for sure, but it really feels like that, doesn't it? It really feels like you bigged it up to the point where his fantastic reports are being taken seriously and the cops think, oh my God, we're going to get this huge rabid crowd of violent 13-year-olds or something.
There were police helicopters there. And what we understand is that when the helicopter crew came back with the photographs, Trevor Morris sat in an office and picked up the people who then got prosecuted and then went to the court case to support the girlfriend. This is just a repellent piece of work.
What a piece of shit, man.
I'm a long time gone from the SWP, but I know who I was then and I know who I am now. And I just think that's provocateur, right?
Yeah.
Just subversion.
It's appalling. There's something really gross about that, isn't there? Picking out the boyfriend, supporting the girlfriend, you know? He's a really sleazy character.
He's trying to be all things to all people, even now as well. So he's that thing that he did back, back then is still what we're seeing in court today, where he is and isn't entirely responsible for something incredibly important, but also wasn't really there. So we heard about there was later an event with a woman called Joy Gardiner. Joy was a student at London Metropolitan University and she came from the Caribbean and her mother was, I think, resident here. Anyway, for various reasons, the immigration authorities wanted to come for her. And it wasn't just immigration authorities who came for her, it was the police as well. She was tied up and she died while being restrained. And this was an event that took place in Tottenham, which has a long history of police brutality and a long history of very, very strained relationship between police and officers. Anyway, there was a lot of fury and understandable rage about what happened to Joy Gardiner. And according to Trevor Morris, he went to a meeting, I think he was told in a civic centre, and he stood in the crowd and there were some very angry voices in the crowd and somebody stood up and said, we want a riot. I'm paraphrasing it. And according to Trevor Morris, and this surely has to be incitement to riot, he stood up and said to the crowd, we must not burn down our shops and houses in Tottenham. We must march on Mayfair and burn the rich.
I mean, it's not a bad idea.
They didn't, though.
No, they didn't. He claims he knew they wouldn't.
He claims they were roadmen, doesn't he?
Yeah, he used the term roadmen a few times. I'm pretty sure we didn't used to say roadmen in the 90s. I mean, maybe they did in London.
Yeah, but it's quite new, isn't it?
Yeah, right. It just doesn't ring true. I mean, there's quite a few of his little anecdotes, things which are not mentioned in his reports. This speech is not in his reports. The firebombing, not in his reports. A bunch of conversations he had with senior members of the SWP, which aren't in reports. Remember, this is a guy who claims he's got special problems with his memory. Yet his power of recall is exemplary.
It's really strange, isn't it? Because I think Operation Hearn, and I don't really know much about it. It's long, long before I knew anything about Spy Cops. But I think he was asked at the time whether he'd had relationships with any women undercover, and he declined to talk about any woman than his wife. Fast forward a few years, and I think I can't remember how the SWP found out he was, but the SWP did find out. And then B, the other woman who's talking to the inquiry, had a visit from inquiry officials. And then he admitted to having slept with B once that was kind of presented to him as a piece of information that had been revealed. But he didn't mention me at all. And so I found out when a member of the undercover research group posted a picture on Facebook, and one of my friends posted it, and then it popped into my feed. And if I hadn't seen the feed that day, I would have been none the wiser now. I mean, it's terrifying.
It is, really is. And how many other people are in the same fucking boat with him, with other people, you know? Because he says he doesn't remember your name.
Well, I wish I could remember his. I mean, all the names. I mean, the reality is this. We think we know that at least 60 women this has happened to. And I know you've talked to other women who are linked to the inquiry, but there are many, many really, truly harrowing stories about what these women have gone through. But it's not, anyway, it's not even personal to any of us. It's systematic. They use the same methods. They repeated the same stories. They have the same exit strategies. So what we as women want to know is, was this or was this not authorised? Did they or did they not talk about us? Was there not a rule book? And as he claims, was he just a raw bad apple? In which case, 60 bad apples and counting? Are they? I mean, and we also want all the names of all the undercover officers to be revealed, because I don't want any other woman to find out by accident or not to have the right to know about the truth about her own past. I mean, this is Stasi territory, right?
Right, completely. It's so much worse. What was particularly bad is that the inquiry is sitting on all this knowledge, and it's been sitting on it for years. And there are people out there who have no idea what really happened to them. And the inquiry could change that overnight, and it's choosing not to.
Yeah, and it's really disturbing, isn't it? It's quite patriarchal. And we have decided what's good for you to know.
Literally that. We've been talking about the way in which the inquiry has changed from tranche 1 to tranche 2. But this is fundamental thing that just shows how bad it is. This is people's lives.
And we should be able to hold powers that be to account, and to help people to account who need information, and to have information we need disclosure. I still have not seen a single file on me, so I have no idea why this person wanted to befriend me, why he was on every demonstration that I saw him on, why he asked me deeply personal questions about me and my friends. I don't know where that information went. It's really hard to have that on your conscience because I'm okay, but who else did I get into trouble? I'll never know that, and neither will they.
Totally. I think that's something which weighs on the minds of all the people who knew undercover cops. I like my personal experience with Marco Jacobs. I mean, his was, got any gossip or scandal? It was one of his catchphrases. I mean, we talk a lot about how they traded in trauma, but they traded in gossip just as much.
Well, they kind of shared the gossip and dished out the trauma, didn't they?
Yeah, literally. It's exactly what they did.
They've done a lot of damage to a lot of people.
And a lot of damage to movements, We talk about events like Welling. There was a lot of people who have gone on that demonstration in Welling. Maybe it was their first demonstration. Maybe they've been on lots in the past. But after that, they weren't going on any demonstrations again. It was a tremendously traumatic thing to get beaten up by riot cops, because unlike being beaten up by some random person in the street, you don't get to feel safe again. You've been beaten up by the cops. There's nobody you can tell. You just need to escape. Otherwise, you're going to get prosecuted and you'll be guilty.
It's horrible, actually, because when you think about what was happening in the 80s and the 90s, there was actual racial violence, actual racial prejudice. I mean, there still is, but it was very, very blatant back in the day. And the response of the police seems to have been, rather than infiltrate the far right and stamp out the people doing the violence, they came for the left and what they call the far left. There were people trying to stop this kind of racist behaviour and systematically tagging people who wanted to change the world for the better. So in my view, it makes me really sad to live in a world like that.
It's horrific. I mean, this whole sort of equivalence of the far right and the far left, I mean, it's best summed up as the far right gave you the Holocaust, the far left gave you the weekends.
Right.
It's appalling. And when we talk about the family of the real Anthony Lewis, and I think their statement at the beginning, before he started being questioned, that really hit the nail on the head when they talked about the way he put them in danger by using their son's identity or their brother's identity. But they also put them in danger as black people because he undermined the movements for justice, anti-racist movements, that put them in greater danger than the individual thing that he did. I think that rang really true.
I think what Marva Lewis said was incredibly moving and powerful. And I think when he came back today and tried to deny having stolen that identity, that just stamped all over all the things that she said, which were very wise. And that's just unforgivable, actually. He did this to his own people. And the one thing that was really interesting today was the David Barr Casey asking the questions, read out a long statement, and the statement started with the summary of the roots of racial oppression. 400 years, have said that of slavery, of the forced movement, of the enslavement, and the talked about migration to the colonial motherland and failures of integration and racism and racial violence. And this turned out to have been a document that Trevor Morris wrote for his superiors. And it was a very, very powerful, moving document. I don't think any of us sitting at the back of the room would have disagreed with anything that he said. But then when he was asked, did you write this? He said, yes. And when asked, did you mean it? He said, yes, from the heart. And then he started to cry. And we all had to stop for about 5 minutes because Trevor Morris was clearly very upset and very moved. And all of us have talked about this since. And the only thing that makes sense to me is that maybe for a moment he had a sense of the crashing contradictions of his own position.
Yeah. He talks in detail about the way in which Joy Gardner was murdered by the police, which is, for anybody who's not familiar with the details, we're talking now on the anniversary of her death today. That's happened so many times at the inquiry where we're talking about something and it's the anniversary of it.
And the memories are so still fresh,
Right. And it's so brutal. Like the way they treated her in killing her, because all the cops got off. But there's no doubt in anybody's mind it was a really cold-blooded, horrific murder with elements of torture in it as well. And, these cops got off. The Met Police made sure they weren't going to be made to answer for their crimes. And Trevor Morris is one of the officers who was part of that. He was there quelling the discontent with the people who were angry. He was going to that room full of angry people, after the death. But then all the way through, when the verdict came through and the officers were acquitted, he was there making sure the movements that were trying to hold the police to account were ineffective. He's culpable. I mean, he may not have trussed up Joy Gardner and stood there while she died, but he's guilty.
But he's part of the whole structure.
Yeah.
I don't know. You live with that.
I couldn't live with that. I don't know how he could. And maybe for a few brief moments that got through to him.
I'd like to think that's the case. I'd like to think somewhere in there is a conscience. He has to recognise that the policing that happened then was damaging and alienating. And it probably caused way more problems than it saw for young people in the inner cities.
Yeah, and it laid the foundations for the problems we see today. Last Saturday, we had this giant fascist march in London. All right, they've changed slightly now. It's just about Muslims. Like Southport the other day, where they tried to burn down the mosque. I mean, these movements have continued because they've been protected by the police. In the same way they were protected in the 90s. It's continuing through to now.
Yeah. And nothing has been resolved. So I don't know if he feels that his policing was a success. I think we were begged to differ.
Yeah, you get the impression it was all about his career. I don't think he cared about anybody else, apart from his own personal career. Him getting on, That seems to be his motivation, really. The whole thing of his, you've talked about a bit how he said it was real, how he was a committed activist and that was real. Like when he was undercover, it was real. It was all real. And we're like, no, Trevor, you silly twat. The whole way that he tries to separate off his undercover identity and make out with something genuine in some way, it's really insulting.
Yeah, and that's really toxic. For the women involved, it's like these as well. One thing that's especially insulting about what Trevor Morris says about his sexual escapades, he says, obviously, it would have been better had it not happened. But it was my alter ego after all. I mean, I was being my alter ego when these sexual encounters happened. So, I mean, what does that mean? If it was him, but it wasn't him, those are things that physically happened. You don't just get to go, oh, it wasn't really me. I mean, that is insulting and that is damaging. And that's actually really traumatizing because as used as felt on disclosure, on discovery, it's doubly insulting when you hear him repeat it. Yeah, they're no words.
No, there really isn't.
We've had apologies from the police for what they're worth. He's shown no sign of remorse for what he did to either be or to me so far. Maybe he'll have a chance to talk about that tomorrow, but I'm not holding my breath.
No. So tomorrow, I mean, literally, his questioning so far hasn't really touched any of the relationships. Like you said, there's the two of you. We don't know if there might have been more. There may have been more.
We do wonder whether there might have been more one-night stands. I mean, there are hints of that.
There are, yeah.
You may not know.
Yeah. So, I mean, is there anything you're hoping for tomorrow? Any particular questions you really like to see put to him?
I don't think there's anything he can say that will make any of this better. I did it for a long time about whether to come to the inquiry, whether to give evidence in person or just to give a written statement. So many of the police have just written statements and that haven't appeared. But I've been sitting in the hearing room this week and I have had him, within my eye line. And to me, that's been something powerful that I've done for myself.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything that he could bring to the party that will make any of this sort of all right, frankly. But maybe by being with other campaigners and by hearing from the horse's mouth and seeing the person that he actually is, there's maybe some kind of resolution that, despite of, but not because of him.
Yeah, totally. The best revenge is living well, comrade.
Damn right, comrade. Cheers to that.
Cheers to that. They've got fuck all, man. They've got fuck all. They've got their careers. He's written a book and he's got a fucking podcast series. We've got each other. We've got different worlds in our hearts, and we're more possible than they can powerfully imagine.
Amen to that.
Amen to that. Is there anything else you want to say about him? Fuck him. Thanks for joining us. This was quite a trip, this episode. There's probably loads more to be said about Trevor Morris. Maybe we'll visit him again. Maybe Jenny will talk to us again. Maybe not. Who knows? But yeah, check out the other episodes. This first one you've heard. Check out the hashtag SpyCops on all social media. You'll find loads of stuff about it. And we'll see you again next time. Cheers. Thanks to Maxine Peake for taking part in this episode. Thanks to Jenny. Thanks to the organisation she's a part of, Police Spies Out of Lives, for making this happen, and everything that you do, really. Thanks to everybody who supported me by buying me a coffee. Link in the show notes. Find out more at spycops.info.